Okay, welcome everyone to our Southern Maryland Audubon Society lecture. Tonight our topic is climate change in autumn, fruit availability for migrant birds. And our speaker is Dr. Amanda Gallinat. She is an ecologist who studies how environmental change affects plants, birds, and their interactions. Her research incorporates the historical field notes of Henry David Thoreau, long-term bird banding records, museum specimens, and field observations. And her work has been featured by National Audubon Society, the Wildlife Society, and American Scientist. Amanda has a BA from Carleton College and a PhD from Boston University, and she's currently postdoctoral research fellow at Utah State University. I'm actually quite fascinated. She has also conducted research with Costa Rica bird observatories, the Palo Marin Bird Banding Station in California, and Manomet Bird Observatory in Massachusetts. So welcome, Dr. Gallinat.
Thank you so much for having me here to speak with your group tonight. I really appreciate the invitation, and I also appreciate you all being here. I know there are a lot of things competing for our attention right now, so thanks so much for being here. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and you all can let me know with a thumbs up or something if we, oh, let's see, did I get the right one? Let's see. Okay, are you seeing the right screen there?
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay. So yes, thank you for that introduction. My name is Amanda Gallinat, and I am a current postdoctoral researcher at Utah State University. And I was a PhD student at Boston University in Massachusetts. And so that's going to be the focus of a lot of this work is Boston University and Massachusetts. And so let's see, sorry, I'm just figuring out here. I have this box here on the right side, and if you use that box to sort of pop the screen just into my face, if you put it there in the screen, sometimes that helps to not overlap with the content of the slides. And so feel free to if you can see how to do that quickly, you can pop me into this little box. Otherwise, you shouldn't worry about missing too much. But I like to put that there just in case when we're on Zoom. And so I'm really excited to talk to you tonight about some of the work that I did as a PhD student, looking at the effects of climate change on the seasons and how climate change and invasive plants alter fruit availability for migratory birds in autumn. So around the world, temperatures are increasing. We know that global land surface temperatures are increasing as a result of anthropogenic emissions of heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide and methane. And in this figure from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you can see that from the early 1900s to 2012, there was an increase of about 1 degree centigrade or 2 degrees Fahrenheit over that period of time on average. And that warming really disproportionately affects these high latitude northern hemisphere locations like the Northeast United States. And so in that area, we had, as you can see from this legend down here, up to 2.5 degrees centigrade or 5 degrees Fahrenheit warming over that location, over that region. And we've seen actually continued warming since this figure was released in 2014, with 2019 being the second warmest year on record after 2016, which was the warmest year. And in fact, since this figure was released in 2014, we've experienced the 5 hottest years on record. And so this is really an ongoing problem. And as a biologist, I'm interested in how this affects plants and animals, and particularly in those really warm regions in the Northeast. One way that plants and animals can respond to warming temperatures is by moving in space. And so many species in the Northern Hemisphere, again, are shifting northward, and species everywhere are expected to shift poleward toward the poles to continue matching the environmental conditions that they are accustomed to. And so as temperatures warm, those environmental conditions are moving northward, and it's expected that a lot of plants and animals will move in kind. So for instance, this is a projection that Audubon put out for the range of the common loon. And as you can see, both summer and winter ranges are shifting northward in latitude. This is I said expected to, this can be a limitation for some species. For instance, plants can be limited in their ability to move from place to place. And you can imagine that without the plants that they're accustomed to interacting with, insects and birds and other wildlife also can face restrictions in their movement. And so we're sort of seeing this unfold before us and seeing how, what the capacity of plants and animals is to really shift in space. Another way that plants and animals can respond to warming temperatures is by moving in time. And so as they attempt to maintain those environmental conditions in a warming world and with changing precipitation and other changes associated with climate change, we can see plants and animals shifting the timing of events like leafing out and flowering in plants and insect emergence and migratory bird arrivals in the spring. To give you another example, this is a visualization of leafing out time. So it's the spring leaf index anomaly, which is just when different plants leaf out across the United States, from the National Phenology Network. And so this is a citizen science observation network that welcomes people with any level of scientific background from across the country to submit their observations of plants and animals from anywhere around them. So I recommend this, and we can remind me if you'd like me to forward along the information about the NPN. But as you can see, leaf out, so leaves unfolding, sort of creeps northward from the start of spring, or from the start of the year to about mid to late March. And that's as far as this figure goes for now. But you can see that, from the legend on the bottom, that if we were seeing this year compared to the last 30 years, the average of the last 30 years, if it were no different, we would see it all sort of a wave of white moving upward. And as you can see, in fact, this was a really warm year, and we saw a lot of leafing out happening up to 20 days early this year compared to previous years. And so again, those plants are responding to temperatures like most gardeners know that plants do in the spring, and they're responding to those warmer temperatures by advancing or moving their leaf out earlier in the year. And so we call this study of the timing of seasonal biological events phenology, as you might have guessed from the name, the National Phenology Network. And this is phenology, the timing of seasonal biological events, is one of the fastest and most visible ways that we can understand the effects of climate change on plants and animals. And some of our best information about how climate change is affecting phenology is from long-term records that are in single locations. So we can really see the effects of long-term change on the same communities of plants and animals. And one of the best examples of this comes from Concord, Massachusetts, and it's the long-term records of Henry David Thoreau, the philosopher who recorded flowering times during his time at Walden Pond. And researchers from the lab where I was a PhD student at Boston University used these records to look at long-term changes from the 1850s to present in flowering times. And so this is work that started before I arrived in the lab, but has continued to go on to the present day. And so the first thing that they had to do was to, as you can see, sort of decipher Henry David Thoreau's handwriting. He has some pretty challenging handwriting to read. And so he wrote these records that have the date. It doesn't include the month here, but he had the month, all of the dates, and then he would go out and record anything that was happening. So leafing out and flowering times, among other natural history events. So the researchers in the Premack lab then went back out and resurveyed the same sites and the same plant communities in the early 2000s. And they looked at how shifts in temperature from the 1850s to present affect flowering times. And so you can see here mean spring temperature on the x-axis of this figure and mean first flowering date on the y-axis. And as temperatures have increased, and you can see the two warmest years here in the data set are 2012 and 2010, the mean flowering date has gotten earlier. And one of the best examples in terms of the species in this community is highbush blueberry, which flowered in mid-May in 1855 when Henry David Thoreau was observing it. And when they went back to survey it in 2012, it flowered on April 1st. So that was a full 6 weeks earlier. And that results from, as you can see here in this figure, warming temperatures over that period of time. And one of the reasons that we really want to understand how plants and animals are shifting their timing with warming temperatures and other climate changes is because those shifts, if they occur in different directions, so some getting later, some getting earlier, or different magnitudes, maybe some are changing on the order of days and some by weeks, that can really disrupt important ecological relationships. In the spring, insects need to emerge at a time when there are soft young leaves available for them to eat. And birds need to arrive and begin nesting in time to take advantage of that peak biomass of insects, or that peak insect availability for feeding themselves and their young. And so in what we might say a normal year, we would expect these events to roughly overlap with one another. And I'll just say now, this is an oversimplification to have these perfectly overlapping from the start. And these single pictures represent a group, but of course that group is really a distribution of different species happening at different times. But still, we can look at how these groups change in relation to one another to understand how the species interactions might be changing. In a warm year, the results from those studies out at Concord, Massachusetts suggest that we'll see a shift of about 1 day earlier with bird arrivals, 4 days earlier for insect emergence, and 6 days earlier for leaf out. And one of the reasons, you might wonder, why are birds less sensitive to warming temperatures on the breeding grounds than leaves and insects? And of course, many of the birds that are migrating in, well, any migratory bird is really responding to different local cues. So if they are migrating from, say, Central or South America, they are responding to local cues on site there, which may be more or less linked to the breeding grounds. If they're short distance migrants, for instance, they might have a better sense of what's going on, might be responding to temperatures that are more like the breeding grounds, but really they're not responding to the same environment as these plants and insects. And so the shifts in these plants and insects is stronger than what we see in birds. And that really is reflected in many other systems beyond Massachusetts, including systems in Europe, among other temperate systems like Japan and also sort of other European systems generally. And so in a really warm year, we see even greater shifts among these groups. And the concern that we have is that those differences among groups will lead to disruptions in the ecological relationships between them. We know that this is actually already happening. And one of the best examples that we have is that of pied flycatchers, and as well as great tits and blue tits in the UK. And they really rely on the presence of oak caterpillars to feed their young in the spring during the nesting season. And what researchers found when they were investigating the synchrony of these two groups in the UK was that if you compare the first egg date, so the nesting date of these birds, to the peak frass date, frass being caterpillar species, and that generally reflects the biomass of caterpillars, if they expected them to be perfectly synchronous, they would be on this one-to-one line, so that the caterpillars are emerging right when the birds are ready to take advantage of that big peak in caterpillar abundance. But as you can see here, this is what they observed. And they saw that, yes, in some years, they're pretty well synchronized, but especially in warm years and with warming temperatures, they see a disconnect from that one-to-one line where caterpillars are emerging earlier than the birds are arriving and starting to lay eggs. And so there's this mismatch between birds and caterpillars in particularly warm years. And they've seen that that has had impacts on the fitness of those birds. And so it can have impacts on the survival and the quality of the nestlings that those birds are producing. So we know that different groups of plants and animals are shifting their phenology in response to warming temperatures in the Northeast and in other systems. And we know that those shifts can have really important consequences for plant and animal fitness. And so when I arrived at Boston University as a graduate student in 2012, I arrived in the autumn, and it was my first time really living in New England, and I noticed everybody was really, there was a whole culture around the autumn. And so as I got really into autumn, I was reading about all of this evidence that we have of the effects of climate change on spring events. But I was seeing around me all of these autumn events. Birders were really excited about bird departures and autumn migration. I was seeing so many people taking photographs of leaf drop, and this is such a big industry in the Northeast. It's also really important for things like soil inputs and the length of the growing season. Of course, we think a lot about arthropods, so things like ticks and how their active season is changing. And then also, this is when a lot of fruits are available for migratory birds and other wildlife. And this can have really important implications for plants and how they disperse. And what I found as I was looking into this and reading about these things is that we know much less about these events than we do about spring, even though they are really important. And so there might be a few reasons for this. One is that it is much harder to observe the last of something than the first. And so in the spring, of course, it's much easier to see the first bird arrive back of a species. And it's harder to say when you saw the last bird of a species depart. And so that's one reason that we might not have quite as much data on autumn, or as much research on the timing of autumn events. We also know that we have fewer long-term data sets. So this focus on spring has been a long-term issue, and it can be really challenging, therefore, to do the same kind of work that we do with those data from Henry David Thoreau, for instance. And so those are some of the reasons that we know less about autumn. Nonetheless, I was determined that we would learn about whether similar shifts occur in autumn. And so at this point, I just want to pause and see if anything so far hasn't been clear, or if I can take any questions right now. And I meant to mention at the beginning that you're welcome to type questions into the chat as we go. But if there are no questions right now, I'm happy to keep going. So maybe I'll wait for a few seconds and see if anyone wants to unmute and ask anything. Okay. If you have any questions about what you've heard already, or as we go, feel free to type them in the chat, or we can take them all at the end. That's all right too. So back to this question, do similar shifts occur in autumn as what we see in the spring? And could they have similar fitness consequences? And from all of these different phenological events, I really found I was the most curious about two events in particular, so fruit ripening times and bird migration times. And there are two reasons, main reasons for this interest. One is that we have all of this evidence that in the spring, birds becoming disconnected in time from their food resources can have really important consequences for birds. And we know that migration is a high mortality event for birds. And so this is a time when it's really important for them to have all of the nutrients that they need. The other reason is that this is just a really important ecological relationship for both the birds getting those nutrients for that high mortality event, but also for the plants, which rely on the birds to defecate out the seeds and disperse them across the landscape. In many cases, these fleshy fruited plants are relying almost entirely on birds to spread them out and propagate those plants across the landscape. And so I wanted to look at this in a similar framework to what I set up before with spring, and ask, how are autumn events moving in time with warming temperatures? As temperatures warm, I had three questions. One, are bird migration times shifting? Two, are fruiting times shifting? And three, are bird-fruit interactions changing? So are those shifts in relation to one another changing the fruits that are available to birds in autumn? So for this first question, we went to Manomet, and Manomet, as you can see here, is right on the coast of Massachusetts. And it's a long-term bird banding station that's been in operation since the late 1960s. It is the oldest observatory on the Atlantic flyway for migratory birds. And it's a really common stopover site. As you can imagine, especially young birds fly out to the coast, they realize they've gone too far, and they come back and hug the coast on the way down. And so as they hit this landmass, many of them will stop and refuel. And so if I imagine some of you have seen bird banding or engaged in bird banding before, but just in case there are folks who haven't, at Manomet, what they do to sample birds, and have been doing since the late 1960s, is they set up these mist nets, and they have 50 of them set up around the grounds of Manomet. So 50 of these walls of net, it's a fine nylon mesh, and birds, they'll put it between vegetation that birds will fly into the net and fall into one of these soft pockets. They'll get lightly tangled, but it's a very safe process for the birds. And I'll just point out also that having trained as a bird bander, there is so much training and emphasis on safety, which is really, I think, what makes this kind of sampling work. And so the birds will fly into the nets. The bird banders will go around every 30 minutes to an hour. And I should mention these nets at Manomet since the late 1960s have been set up 5 days a week, 12 hours a day. And so these dedicated bird banders will go around from net to net, and they'll carefully extract those birds from the net, put them into soft cloth bags, and then take them back to the banding station, where they put a band on the bird that is an aluminum band. It's very lightweight, and it has a unique identifying code on it. So all of the bands come from one central location, and so no two birds have the same code. And we do that in case we recapture a bird or somebody else captures a bird that we've banded, and we can learn more about it. We also record lots of information about the bird, like the species, the age, the sex of the bird, and lots of information about its demographics and its body condition. And then we release the bird and hopefully inspire some new birders along the way. And so what this kind of long-term data allows us to do is to look at how different species are changing the average time that they pass through Manomet, with changes in temperature and also changes over time. And what we found from the data in Manomet is that 13 common migratory bird species are delaying their migration in warm years. So unlike that, we saw sort of uniform shifts toward earlier events with warmer temperatures in the spring, here we see that many species are delaying migration. And so I'll walk through this figure. We have on the y-axis change in departure date with increasing temperature. And so this is their sensitivity to temperature. And if it's a positive number, that means they're delaying their migration with each degree increase in temperature. And if it's a negative number, that they're advancing, or they're making they're departing earlier. And then on the x-axis here is the mean departure date. And this is just in day of year. It ranges from September to late October. This is, so I should also point out, anything above this line is delaying its migration. And these 4-letter codes are codes that we use for birds in bird research. This is, for instance, the blackpoll warbler. This is the myrtle warbler, and this is the hermit thrush. And we actually had both hermit thrush and Swainson's thrush, which are very frugivorous birds. So they eat a lot of fruits, migrating later with warm temperature.
Come here. Come
here. And so I think I accidentally pushed a button there. Oh. Can someone unmute and confirm if you can hear me?
So that, yeah. Okay.
Oh, can you all hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. I have an ask to unmute button here. So I thought maybe I was muted. Okay, so sorry about that. So what we find from that study, and what answers our first question, is bird migration times are shifting later in the autumn with warming temperatures. Not by a lot, but by enough that this could make a difference depending on what our fruits are doing. And so our next question was, are fruiting times changing with climate change, or shifting with climate change? We realized that in order to understand how bird-fruit interactions might be changing in our next question, we would also want to know when fruits are available now. So as they change, we can better understand which different fruits might be available to birds across the course of the season. I mentioned before that we really don't have many of the same types of community-wide long-term fruiting data that we do for spring events like flowering. And so we had to get a little bit creative about how we answer this question. And this is a big hint over here. But what we ended up turning to was herbarium specimens. So these are plants that are collected in the field and then pressed, and they're housed in museums. And these specimens can give us a really broad geographic range. So they're collected across New England and actually around the world. There are herbarium specimens that are available for research. And they can also give us a long range in time, as many of the specimens in New England were collected from the early 1800s to the mid 1900s. There are also many specimens that are collected from fleshy fruited species, and as many specimens, well, a perk of this is actually that a lot of specimens are available online now. And so this is data collection that can be done without traveling, which of course is now more important to us than it even was at the time. But it makes it much easier to process a lot of herbarium specimens at once. And so we observed specimens looking for evidence of fruiting, like this specimen here. We went to 7 herbaria, either online or in person, across New England. The specimens that we found ranged from 1850 collection date to 2010. And we found fruits on 55 species, including native and invasive species. We ended up looking at over 15,000 specimens, and we found just over 3,000 of them with ripe fruit. And so to give you just a look at what we were doing, we were looking for evidence of ripe fruit, which we were using things like fruit size. Sometimes we could use fruit color, though, as you might imagine, some of the older specimens can change in their color, and so we were careful with that one. And then we were also using the apparent texture of the fruit when it was pressed. And from these tags on the specimens, we can get a sense of when it was collected and where it was collected, and then also the species. So this is a Japanese barberry plant. So this is one of our invasive species. And so we looked at whether plants are advancing their fruiting times with warming temperatures. And one of the things we found, because we were the first people to try and use these museum specimens to understand when plants are fruiting and how they might be responding to warmer temperatures, is that in fact there is a limitation of these specimens that we didn't realize when we started. And so you can imagine with flowering, which happens pretty quickly, the flowers will open. They'll generally be open with many flowers for a couple of days at most. With fruiting, so if you see a specimen and it has a flower on it, then generally you have a pretty small window of when that plant might have flowered. And of course we have that information for many species, and so we can pick species that have a shorter flowering window. With fruiting, as many of you are probably aware, you've probably seen fruits on the plant for a long period of time. So plants can keep fruits on longer generally than they can flower. And so if we see a specimen that has fruit on it, we aren't sure whether that's the beginning of the fruiting season, the middle of the fruiting season, or the end of the fruiting season. And it can be a little bit hard to see shifts within species over time if they're not really big shifts. And so what we wanted to do with this was to use just the species for which we had many specimens, so a lot of data. And so we had 2 species, high bush blueberry and low bush blueberry, for which we had many, many specimens. They also tend to fruit for shorter periods of time. And so we looked at changes for these 2 species. And what we found was that they were shifting at a rate, so they were advancing their phenology. Their fruiting was getting earlier with warmer temperatures. And that was happening at about a rate of 5 days earlier per degree increase in temperature, so per degree C increase. And we wanted to make sure, well, first I'll say this is actually remarkably similar to the sensitivity of these 2 species in their flowering time. And so this gives us some indication that that developmental link between flowering and fruiting could be really important for how we understand the magnitude and direction of shifts in fruiting times for different plants. Because we were only able to do this really confidently with 2 species, we also looked to other studies. So there are few, but not 0, other published observations and experiments out there looking at how warming temperatures affect fruiting times. And generally, those observations and experiments support earlier fruiting under warming temperatures. And often they are at similar magnitudes, though it really seems to vary quite a lot. For our next question, when are ripe fruits available in autumn? Because again, as we were looking to see when different fruits were available, a lot of the time we were finding for different species it would say available in autumn, which doesn't help us to understand very well when different birds might encounter some of these fruits. Or it would say available in September. And so we really wanted to use, even though we were, it was a challenge to look at differences within species, we actually had a lot of information about differences across species in when they're fruiting, when their fruits were ripe. And so you can see here along the bottom, we have all of our different species that we looked at for fruiting times in the herbarium. And here we have the sort of summer to autumn fruiting season. And we were really struck by the range of fruiting times, with some of these species fruiting in sort of mid to late July, all the way out to the average, which are these dots with lots of variation around them for these some of these fruits that are later in the season, as late as late October, early November. So a lot of variation among species, and actually we found that the order of species was very consistent across different states in New England, because again, we were looking across the whole region. As you might also have noticed, we started to think about whether there were differences in when native and invasive species were fruiting. And this was one of those situations where it can be really somewhat gratifying to have the science back up an observation that you have in the field. Both myself and others in the lab, in walking around in the woods in New England in the fall, and particularly in the late fall and into the winter, we had all really been aware of how many of the species that we were seeing with fruits still on were these pops of red fruits, things like barberry, which we have Japanese barberry here, and European barberry here, things like euonymus, winged euonymus or burning bush here, multiflora rose, we have bittersweet over here. And so all of these fruits that we were really seeing in overwhelming proportions in the fall, just as an observation, we had noticed were also late season compared to others in the herbarium record. And so we really wanted to know if that difference between native and invasive fruits potentially ripening at different times would show up in a statistical analysis. So was that a real difference between those two groups? We used a type of analysis that takes into account the evolutionary history of these species and how related they are to one another, to make sure that we don't have any groups of species really dominating the differences between those two groups. And what we found was that when we took that into account, we still had a significant difference between when native and invasive species fruit. And that difference is about 26 days. So almost a month difference between our native species and invasive species on average. So of course, we're starting to think about how that might affect our birds that are migrating later and later into the season. So to bring that back into our framework from before, in a warm year, we have our birds migrating later. Our fruits tend to ripen earlier, which again, this is really different from our spring events where we were seeing uniform shifts earlier with warmer temperatures. And even though this difference is small, or this shift is small among the birds, if we're having really big shifts or even moderate shifts in our fruits, because they're moving in opposite directions, this could have a really big impact on which fruits are encountered by those birds. And certainly this window that's left open concerns us because we know now that invasive fruits ripen later than native fruits. And so our question that followed was, of course, are birds more likely to encounter and also consume invasive fruits under climate change if those invasive fruits are later in the season and our birds are migrating later and later? So I thought I would just pause again before we go into that last question and see if you guys have any questions, burning questions before we move on. And I actually realize I can't see the chat with this open. So moderators, please let me know if you see anything.
I don't see any questions yet, Amanda.
All right. Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
I
Should we move on?
don't know if anyone is planning to type. I guess we can wait just a moment if you like.
Sure.
Sorry, that's my
job.
job.
Also do them at the end. That's all right with me.
Okay, okay.
All right, then I think I'll move on. But again, please feel free to type questions in the chat and we can do them at the end. So this last question, are birds more likely to encounter and consume invasive fruits under climate change? This is really it all comes together in this question, right? This is where we really see if those shifts with climate are affecting the nutrition that those birds might be getting and the spread of these invasive plants. This is where we see whether that mismatch is occurring. And so to ask this question, or to address this question, we went, excuse me, back to Manomet. And I'm giving you a slightly different picture of Manomet here now. But this is the banding station here on the bottom left of this aerial view of Manomet. And each of these white bars are one of the 50 mist nets. Some of them are doubled up. So trust me that there are 50 mist nets there. So the banders, as I mentioned before, but every 30 minutes to an hour, they walk this blue trail that I've drawn in here. So they walk the banding trail and they're looking for birds in the mist nets. And we used this same trail as our Phenology trail. And so we identified between 2 and 5 individuals, generally 5 when we could find them, individuals of each of 25 native and invasive species. So the total, I should say, is 25 species, including both invasive and native species. And along this trail, we were monitoring the beginning, middle, and end of fruiting phenology. And we were somewhat surprised to find, not only, I would say we were interested in part in validating this method that we had started and were the first to do with the herbarium specimens. We wanted to know if on the ground we would see the same differences between native and invasive species as we did with the herbarium specimens. And so we were a little surprised that we found exactly the same difference between native and invasive plants. So we had overlapping species in the 2 data sets between these on-the-ground observations at Manomet and the herbarium observations. But both of these revealed that invasive plants fruit on average 26 days later than native plants. And so that was also really helpful for understanding whether we could use this herbarium technique in the future. And it looks like, in fact, to see differences among species, it is a really a valuable resource to us. But of course, just because our invasive plants are fruiting late in the season, their phenology is later, it doesn't mean they're super abundant. It doesn't mean that that's what's available later in the season. And so we also did some availability observations in addition to our phenology observations. And we did those on either side of randomly selected nets across Manomet. And so we had different 1 meter squared, I believe 5 1 meter squared plots on either side of the nets where these stars are. And we were within those quadrats, we were looking at how many fruits, we were estimating how many of these fruits were ripe. And so this is, for instance, a blackberry or gooseberry that we were looking at to see how many fruits on average were available of each of these species. So combining phenology and the availability of these fruits. And so what we found from that survey is that indeed invasive fruits are highly available in late autumn. And so even though, well, sort of matching the late phenology, we also see that they really do make up the bulk of the fruits that are available. So I'll walk through this figure. This is the proportion of total ripe fruits on the y-axis, and this is, again, the date across the migration season on the y-axis, or on the x-axis. And this is just proportion of total fruits. So this is 100% up here, and you can see these are lower proportions down here. We start with, well, I'll also say the red asterisk denotes an invasive species. So we start the season before migration really takes off with a peak of honeysuckle. A lot of birds are eating that honeysuckle prior to the migration season, prior to us seeing a lot of migratory birds coming through Manomet. And so as migration picks up, we have this peak of 2 really heavy producing native species, so trees, black cherry and tupelo. And then as those sort of decline in abundance, we have this suite of invasive species, invasive shrubs, and taking over in terms of the availability of fruit. And that includes barberry, winged euonymus, multiflora rose, and privet. And then we also had a little bit of greenbrier, which is native in there. So we can say, yes, our birds are more likely to encounter invasive fruits as they migrate later in the season. But are they more likely to consume them? And in order to answer this question, we did a third type of sampling, and that was fecal sampling of the captured birds at Manomet. And so I mentioned earlier, the birds will get caught in a net, and the banders will put them in these soft cloth bags to take them back to the banding station. It helps to calm the birds and really limit sort of the stimulation that they're getting from the process, and so keeps them safe. And in that process, often birds will deposit a sample for us. And so the banders collected over 2 seasons, 2014 and 2015 seasons, 970 samples, fecal samples from these birds. And we took them back to the lab, and along with a very dedicated team of undergraduates that I'm so grateful for, we picked seeds out of these samples under a microscope. We found that of those 970 samples, 469 of them had seeds in them, and they came from a total of 19 bird species. In order to identify those seeds that came from the samples, I made a reference collection of seeds from plants identified on the grounds of Manomet. And this is just a small representation of the reference collection, which we generally kept in alcohol along with the samples of seeds from the samples. So let's see. Oh, the last thing I wanted to mention, in case we have any insect enthusiasts in the room, is that we were really surprised to find that of these 469 samples with seeds, we had 465 of them with some evidence of insect consumption as well. And so things like elytra, or the hardened wings of beetles, we had evidence of legs and heads and all sorts of different insect parts in the fecal samples. And so it's really clear that even the birds that are eating a lot of fruit are eating insects at the same time. And so this is the same figure from before. This is what's available on the landscape. And again, we have that peak of honeysuckle dropping down. We have these two high producing native tree species. And then we have this suite of invasive species at the end of the season. And so I'm going to put that one above here. That's that figure again. And we would expect that if these birds have no preferences, if they're eating what's available to them, that we would see this same peak in a suite of invasive species at the end of the season when we look at what's available in the samples. So this is similar. It's also a proportion of the total samples. And as you can probably see here, the only real similarity between these two figures is that peak of Tupelo. They seem to like Tupelo, and it is available. But if we compare that end of season, we do not see an increase in these available, abundant, invasive plants, seeds in the samples. We see instead Virginia creeper, we see winterberry, bayberry, and greenbrier. We do see a brief peak in bittersweet in a week when we didn't have a ton of samples. But we generally really don't see a lot of invasive species later in the season. I'll also point out that blueberry and blackberry, that rubus that I was pointing out before, is really, those are available or they're present in great proportions in the fecal samples compared to where, to how available they are on the landscape. And we do see cherry, this blue line, appearing in the samples, but not in the same proportions, because they really seem to like the blueberry and blackberry available at Manomet. And so clearly these birds have preferences, and they seem to have preferences for native species even when they are available in low abundances, even when those birds really have to go looking for them. And so again, we find that yes, birds are more likely to encounter abundant invasive fruits later in the season, but they don't eat them. They're really eating native fruits in whatever proportion they're available. They really seem to be seeking out those fruits. And I mentioned before, even though these are advancing with warming temperatures, that these images really represent a distribution of species that are spread out a little bit more across the season. And so that doesn't mean that we have to plant these early season fruits for the birds. We can also consider some of these later season fruits like viburnum, which doesn't come up much in this study because it was having sort of a low year when we did the availability observations, but we know from other years and from other studies that the birds really benefit from viburnum, and also greenbrier and Virginia creeper are all plants that are available to birds, at least for now, later in the season, and they really seem to seek them out. One of the reasons that we think that birds are seeking out native fruits is because they have higher nutritional qualities, better nutritional qualities for these birds on migration as they gear up and proceed with migration. And so there's some work that's been done by Susan Smith Pagano's group and Scott McWilliams's group out on Block Island, Rhode Island, where they've looked at the nutritional content of many of the same species that we had in our study. And they have found that the energy density of native fruits is higher than that of invasive fruits on average. And also that native fruits tend to have higher quantities of sort of anthocyanins and other important qualities for their immune function. And so that's one reason that we might be seeing these preferences, is that birds really know what is good for their immune systems and for packing on fat before migration. An open question for us is, who is eating these invasive fruits? You know, if not birds on migration during the peak of migration or at the end of migration, who's eating the invasive fruits? And one of the possibilities is that they're really they're being consumed by wildlife, including resident birds, in the winter time. And so once really the migratory birds are gone and the native fruits are all gone, that these invasive fruits become more attractive to resident birds that don't have to sort of pack on the same kind of fat for as migratory birds do, and they can kind of take their time. This also opens up the possibility that the availability of these invasive fruits may have allowed some of the winter ranges of birds like robins and great catbirds to expand in New England in the winter in recent decades. And then the last thing I want to point out is we really still don't know a lot about how insects play into this story. We know that insects are declining in biomass globally in a lot of different systems. And so even though their autumn phenology is being extended, so their season is longer, their abundance is declining. And so this could make fruits more important for birds, but it certainly means that we need to be managing for both fruits, native fruits, and insects. And so, of course, the question is, what can we do to support birds? One of the things that we can do is to plant native species, and so to manage for native species and to plant native species in our local areas and around our homes. And two species that are, I believe, would be beneficial in your area are arrowwood viburnum and Virginia creeper. But one thing I wanted to point out is, you know, Audubon has been really really forward moving in publicizing some of this research that I have presented here today. And it's just because they have so many great resources for planting and promoting native species. And so I'll just say planting native species has also been shown to increase insect diversity and insect biomass. And so we can really help birds out in multiple ways if we're planting native species in our communities. So the last thing I'll do is just acknowledge that this was all collaborative work. As you can see, there were many people who worked on the projects that I presented here today. I had lots of field and lab support, primarily from undergraduates, really wonderful, enthusiastic Boston University undergraduates. I've had many collaborators on this work, and in particular, I just want to point out Trevor Lloyd Evans, who has been running the Manomet banding program since it started in the late 1960s and continues to lead that program today, and Richard Premack, who is my PhD supervisor, as well as the Nuttall Ornithological Club and the National Science Foundation, who provided much of the funding for this work that I presented. So with that, I'll thank you also, and I would love to take any questions that you might have.
Amanda, this is Tiffany speaking. I'll put on my video again. I just wanted to let you and the other participants know that I have included a URL to Audubon's native plant database in the Zoom chat. And I'd also like to invite our guests to type in questions in the chat, or to go ahead and unmute themselves and turn on their videos if they would like to ask a question. We had one earlier posted by Lynn who asked, are invasive fruits less nutritious? But of course you came to that at the very end.
Spot on, Lynn. Yes. Yes, they are less nutritious, and it really varies. There's another study from North Carolina that suggests that some of their invasive fruits are not less nutritious. And so it is really, this can be really species specific in some cases, and it's worth sort of, I'll say, some of the, you may have noticed actually as I was showing pictures of those fruits, the purple and black and blue fruits can be in many cases more nutritious than some of the red fruits. And particular, there's been some really cool work out of Scott McWilliams' group, as I mentioned before, looking at antioxidants in those blue fruits. And so, one of the things we say about those red fruits is like they're advertising really hard, but the birds may not be buying because they know better. They're making smart choices about what they need to survive migration.
Right. I had always read about the heavenly bamboo and those red berries. It's an invasive, but the red berries actually in large doses can be poisonous for the birds. But most of the time, they are still on the plants in the dead of winter. I don't think anyone's eating those.
Yeah, it can be really, this is one of those things about, there are some fruits that need to freeze before birds will eat them, or some birds that need those fruits to freeze. So it is really worth sort of knowing the fruits and knowing what birds are in your area that might have different needs with those fruits.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in the chat. Terry Thur asks, is Amur honeysuckle bush good, or should I remove them?
You're really testing my species specific knowledge here. I believe that Amur honeysuckles are an invasive bush. Does anyone want to confirm that is an invasive plant in your area? I'm gonna say I'm 95% sure, and so maybe we can double check if anyone has a browser open.
Yeah.
But in that case, I would say, it is, again, they're sort of species specific things, and so I would say likely it's not as nutritious for birds as native species. And in some cases, honestly, it can depend on where you are. If your invasive species is actually out competing native species or not, it could be enough, in fact, to plant some native species that might be beneficial in that area. So things like viburnum, that we know that birds really, really like and that they really benefit from. And if you don't see that being out competed by your honeysuckle, which in many areas, it's not that they'll actually out compete one another. It's that those honeysuckles really like sort of open habitat, and we've created a lot of that, and so they're invasive in that way. So it's, I would say it's more worth making sure that you have some of those native species rather than necessarily getting rid of your honeysuckle. Though I would probably say yes, replace it with some native species for those birds, because of course if it's fruiting, it could be then spreading some more. So
right, we did get a reply. Mariah Rose Dean says that Amur honeysuckle is tier 1 invasive in Maryland.
Okay, so maybe remove it.
Yeah, maybe remove it.
I know there are different competing interests sometimes in how we're choosing the plants that we plant. And actually many of our invasive species are planted, or they've done so well because we like the way they look. And so I would say, if you really have the birds in mind, and also that that work that I mentioned at the end showing that native insects really benefit from native plants. I think that's also a really good reason to consider, removing invasive species, planting native species. That's actually work that has been featured in Audubon. That's if you see the name Doug Tallamy, he's a professor at the University of Delaware, and has just done some really cool work showing that with landscaping, if we're planting more native species, we see a greater diversity and abundance of insects, and that leads to a greater diversity of birds. And so, I guess I'm saying I understand the competing pressures for what we plant, but certainly that can have really important ecological consequences.
I have just a couple other comments and questions here. Anne noted that pokeberry is a native plant for Southern Maryland, per Audubon's native plant finder, and she's laughing about that. I know that they spread a lot, but I do also know that the birds love the berries.
Yeah, they really do.
and they're a pain because they have such deep, long tap roots and everything to try to get rid of.
Yeah.
There is another question Gwen Peters asks, what about our native holly tree berries? And I guess she's asking, are they good for birds or not? Gwen, you can tell us if I'm misunderstanding.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that is kind of like the ilex, the holly that was in our study, and we did find that birds ate it. But I also know from walking around in the woods in Maine in the winter, it is one of the last things to go. And so it's another one of those red fruits versus some of the native fruits that are sort of like pokeberry, for instance. That's one where, certainly the fruits seem to be removed at some point in the season in some places. It's still, there's a lot of open areas for learning more about how those species that are still on toward the end of the autumn season are being used. And I would say, I don't want to neglect in talking about our migratory birds, neglect those overwintering resident birds that do tend to eat some of those holly berries and other wildlife as well. So as far as I understand, the holly isn't having a negative consequence for the birds. It seems to be one of those native species that we did see evidence that they were eating in our study. So yeah, I would say I wouldn't worry too much about the holly.
I just want to, just an observation from my yard. I bought my house that already had hollies planted in the backyard, and I don't necessarily know whether or not they're the pure native species of holly, but I will say in the summertime, the bees love the flowers. I mean, they are covered in bees. So they must be good for the insects, I would think. So, I mean, there's a whole constellation of considerations. And just in that same vein, I see some other people commenting, just keep in mind some natives can be invasive. Be sure to do your homework before buying. I would still plant an invasive native for the wildlife. Just don't tell Mariah on me. So there's a lot to
I appreciate that. Honestly, I think it is often about doing your homework on the local plants, and unfortunately I can't, as you can tell, I'm limited in my ability to give really regionally specific and species specific tips, but I know that there are I think master gardeners in this room. There are folks who know quite a lot about your local plants, and particularly I think Audubon is a great resource for that. I would agree that, if I may say, an invasive native is not necessarily a bad choice. The you know, those relationships with insects are often, it's the case that, so when we see, you know, planting native species resulting in greater insect diversity and abundance, that's often because those insects can have really specialized relationships with plants. And so whether that's herbivory or pollination, they are, if they've evolved in the same context as those plants, they're more likely to be there. Whereas often with our invasive plants, they're not really promoting that diversity of insects in the same way. And again, those insects are really important for our birds too. We were kind of surprised to see just how constant that insect support was throughout the diet, throughout the season.
Yeah, and I'd just like to toss out another observation from the bird world, where just talking about hollies, for example, I have noticed that in the fall and winter, we get the ruby crown kinglets. And I swear probably 70 or 80% of the time that I see them, they're in holly trees. They're not eating the berries, they're eating insects. But that's just where I see them. And so there are all sorts of ways that native plants help birds, as you're saying, largely through, you know, the insect brood as much as the berry brood. So, and they're just here for the winter.
Yeah, and there are also, I would say, ecological landscapers who would say you also want to have a variety of different structures in your across your landscape or around your home, where that really supports a diversity of birds and also a diversity of insects. And so there's a lot to consider. And I think this is, you know, having native fleshy fruits available for birds and as long into the season as you can is one component of that sort of ecological landscaping.
Yeah, and I do have a couple more observations here. Someone, M. Miller, says, my understanding is that the fruit of the holly needs to get cold before it is eaten. And she says, or she or he says, my holly berries are eaten in the spring by the robins.
We also often find waxwings eating them after they've frozen. So absolutely, I agree. We really only saw, I think we had a frost before the end of our season, and so that might have been why we were seeing some of those holly seeds in the samples.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely, I think that's it becomes a resource for those overwintering birds, and so yeah, I would say. Important in your ecological landscaping as well.
Yeah, Jane also seconds that. She says robins eat holly berries in the early spring when they're migrating northward. So, but I know that another principle. There's so many more knowledgeable people on here tonight than I, but my understanding is that the general principle with gardening with natives is to have a diversity of plant life anyway, because you want to support the diversity of insects and hosting and all of those other considerations, as well as the berries and having things blooming and berrying all at different times to serve different purposes. I would love to hear some of our master gardeners say a little bit about that. If you'd like, please turn on your microphones or your videos if you have anything to add. I say I am not the most, I am certainly not knowledgeable.
I'll jump in for a minute because I am so happy to see so many of the master gardeners that did join us for this evening, you know, which I became a master gardener back in 2015. I'm not as an active one anymore because I do so much bird work. But anyway, I'm glad to see the gang all here and enjoying this with us. I had one question about a non-native shrub that is used in landscape quite a bit. It's the Phaetina. It does a red berry. I don't know if you're familiar with. Well, we've always heard that it was toxic to birds. So I don't know if you've ever run into that. And
so I'm not sure I'm not sure if I know that
Patina.
plant actually. The
It's a
patina.
big, it can grow, well, the ones that I've seen, they're called red tip photinia. Is that what you're talking about, Lynn?
Yes,
P-H-O-T-I-N-I-A.
yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Photinia. Yeah. I do
Yes.
know. I do know this plant, Photinia. Yes, I'm just refreshing my memory now. Yeah. So we did not have this around where we are. I would love to hear from if anyone in the group is familiar with that plant. And yeah, that's not one that I've really thought about.
Yeah.
In,
It's just something we've always heard, and I just
yeah.
always wondered for certain, or if you ran into that. So it's so
Yeah,
prolific
I
too.
recognize, but it's not one that I know in terms or that I have really encountered in some of that bird fruit research. And so, yeah, I'd be really curious to know more, to learn more. Maybe I can do some species specific and see if I can follow up with you about that.
This was marvelous. It was very, very interesting. How we doing on messages?
Yeah, I don't see,
We good?
yeah.
Yeah. I thought I would just follow up really quickly about that, the idea of planting a diversity of plants, and particularly this is something we think a lot about in phenology, because as I pointed out in that spring, when we think about spring and shifts in spring, and in particular the potential for mismatch in that season, one of the relationships that I really didn't touch on is plant pollinator relationships. And there is something that we call sort of climate smart restoration and climate smart landscaping. And that really is where if you can have something blooming and different sort of functional groups of plants blooming at different times, if you can maximize the part of the season or the length of the season where you have something blooming throughout the year, it's, for those generalist pollinators, you can really support them by doing that, because it's, as we see these windows shifting, it's harder and harder for some of those pollinators to find what they need in the spring in those windows. And I think the same is true for when we think about birds and fruit, that we want to make sure that, if we can extend and fill in the gaps in the season where we might have gaps in fruit availability, then for those birds that are generalists, and we really did find that was the case for our catbirds and our Swainson's thrush and our hermit thrush and all of these birds that we see eating a lot of fruits. They're not beyond sort of the preference for those native plants. They weren't too picky about which ones they were eating. So we saw, they were eating a dozen different species of fruit. And so really maximizing the amount of the season that's covered with something can make a big difference.
Thank you.
That's why I always love to promote the importance of native plants, and that they are a host plant for insects, because we know 85% of birds are insectivores. So, we want the insects and the fruit and all of it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that, sometimes in the publications on bird-fruit interactions, it's almost framed as though birds switch to fruit in the fall. And that was why we were surprised to see throughout the season that we were just consistently seeing insects in all of these diets. And so it really sort of puts into perspective for us, what does it mean when we call a bird a frugivore or an omnivore, but switching, that really there's a lot of wiggle room there in those categories.
And we've always been told too, the importance of that higher fat content of the fruit for them to make their fall migration. So that's what I read.
Yeah, I'm seeing also a good point about the language of native and invasive fruits or plants. And so, yes, I think that's totally fair to be to be particular about those names. That you can be a rapid spreading native species, but that we have very particular definitions of what
Which can be okay.
What's that?
Yes.
Oh, did we? Okay.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if someone was jumping in. So yeah, so technically considered aggressive, an aggressive native species. I appreciate you actually filling that in. So sometimes I get a little sloppy with that language, and so I really do. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. I sometimes think about robins that way, actually, as an aggressive native species, because they similarly respond to the kinds of changes that we're making to the landscape. They really are adaptive to those suburban landscapes. And often they can also, be vectors for Lyme disease. And we still love robins, but we recognize that they can be an aggressive, they really are changing in their distributions. We didn't have, if we look at the Christmas bird count data from the 1980s in Massachusetts, there aren't really many robins there. And if we look at it now, they're everywhere. And so this, the bird that was once you hear the robin, you see the robin has arrived and spring is here. Well, they're there all winter now, and they're eating the fruits, and they're, just waiting for that snow to melt. And yeah, they're around now.
Oh, does anyone have any final questions for Dr. Gallinat? See, we've got some comments, but folks didn't know that robins had been changing their patterns. But I think that Audubon has also been doing studies on this, and there are various community science opportunities for people to get involved. And I know in this area anyway, they were doing studies with, Lynn, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I thought it was goldfinches and bluebirds, and I can't remember the third species. I think it may have been nuthatches. Anyway, we had a presentation on it last year, but the counts, of course, are at Christmas and in the winter we do the Peter watches and May count. So they're getting data all the time through eBird and the bird counts. That help us learn. It's really fascinating, and it's great that there are so many people who like to get out in the field and contribute. So if there are any folks here tonight who would like to help us with the Christmas bird count, please give me send me an email. I'm at somdaudubon.president@gmail.com, and would love to help some more people get involved this year. Briefly explain the Christmas bird count. It's going to be slightly different in format this year because normally we go around in smaller groups of like maybe 2 or 3, and we get assigned a certain territory on a certain day, and we basically have someone help us tally, and we look for every species we can identify and count as many as we can for a designated period. So but if you don't know a lot of bird species, that's not really a problem, because it's a great opportunity to learn, and you'll usually be paired up with someone who does know more and can help train you. Does that explain enough? Lynn, do you have anything to add to that? You're muted.
No, I'm not.
There you are.
No, that was perfect. Absolutely perfect. And Mariah, who asked the question about the Christmas bird count, Mariah, I'll contact you too. Just to let you know, Tiffany, Mariah is the Master Gardener. I think the title is the coordinator for St. Mary's County. And we currently don't have a Charles County coordinator. Luke moved, so she's kind of filling in for Charles County right now too. So I was very glad to meet her and get her involved with us tonight. So,
There is also a follow-up question from Terry about will there be info. I think she means on the Christmas bird count on our website. We do have it on the website, though you have to know to go to our newsletter page. It was in the November newsletter. And Lynn, will you be sending out any email about that, or?
how about I'll do that, Terry and Mariah. I'll send info about the Christmas bird count to you guys. That would be great. Maybe we can even do a teeny bit of training, either online or meet at the Port Tobacco River Park.
Yeah, that would be great.
Great.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
And I don't see any other questions, but thank you, Dr. Gallinat. I see you gave us a URL
link.
here.
Yeah,
That's
There are
wonderful.
many things that you can observe for the National Phenology Network. It is a growing community science organization, and I think especially, it has a little bit more sort of scientific rigor in the data collection methods, but it is for any level of scientific background. And I think especially having so many botanically oriented people here, I would be remiss if I didn't just share that to make sure that in case you had interest, especially I think as we're all trying to get outside and connect to the things that calm us, right?
Right. Exactly.
And I think that's been one that's been really helpful to me. And also, I just know so many scientists who use those data sets, and so it really is a big help to us, especially with this year being one where we're missing a lot of data from different data sets that we usually collect and weren't able to collect this year. And so those, never doubt that those community data sets that you're submitting observations to are really important to ecologists everywhere. So thank you if you already submit to them. Thank you if you plan to. And thanks again for having me. It was a really great group to present to. So.
Oh, thank you so very much. We
Great.
loved it. We have lots of other people in the comments saying how much they appreciated it too. Thank you so much, Dr. Gallinat, for coming to join us in the evening like this, when I'm sure you're, already been working all day, but we've just loved it. It's so helpful to us.
Well, thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I will end the session tonight now. Thanks everyone for joining us. So long.